together. When the mind is sluggish, unmindful, then we use energy factors. There are three.
Okay, well, if you were listening to him, as I said, um, Abanta G, you can look him up, the Bhavana Society of West Virginia. I dropped a link in the channel. He was actually talking about impermanence, and that's why I put it on, because it actually fits to what we're talking about here. So again, Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. Anatta meaning not self, right? So again, he said bhikkhus, form. It's not self, form. Rupa. It means everything that, in the universe. So it's not self. We're form, self, right? Yeah, so that we're form, self, right? Then this form would not lead to affliction, and one could not have it of form. Let my form be thus. Let my form be not thus. It's terrible, right? That's why you got to read a number of them, right? So it says, if form were self, then form would not lead to affliction. And I don't like how they say that, because it's not guaranteed that, if it were self, everything would be great. But again, we're trying to get this idea here. Feeling is not self, so Vedana is not self. Perception is not self. Determinations are not self. Consciousness is not self. Were consciousness self, then, there'd be no lead to affliction. Again, I don't agree with that, but what we're trying to get across is there is no actual self. We're just this collection of aggregates, right? And he talks about impermanence. Permanent or impermanent? It's absolutely impermanent, right? Because if you look at things, our mind does not perceive the degradation of things over millennia, say, for example. But if you think of who you are, it's not the same person you were yesterday. Or if you try to think of anything you want to last, right? It won't. Nothing lasts, good or bad, right? So he goes on and says, impermanent. Is it good or bad? It's the tetralemma, the chetaskoti that we talked about. That it's not this nor that. It is this. It's neither. It's both. All at the same time. Right? It's the great doubt we were talking about. But in this case, we're talking about applying that great doubt to the self. We all have an absolute inability to see the self as a construct, right? The feelings wouldn't flow if it were not for the self. So that's what they should be saying, not there'd be no afflictions. What they mean is you wouldn't have feelings if you didn't attach to the self. You wouldn't have perceptions if you didn't attach to the self. But at the same time, I argue we wouldn't have the karma, the action that's required to benefit sentient beings. But we'll go on, right? And it says bhikkhus. Any kind of consciousness whatsoever, whether past, future, or presently arisen, whether gross or subtle, whether in oneself or external, whether inferior or superior, whether far or near, and it goes on and on. None of that is self, right? Because again, it's not a not self, it's not a no self, it's not all about the self, right? Remember, the marks of existence tie in to each other of anatta, and dukkha. All three tie in together. Dukkha, do for not good, bad. Ka, this is not everyone agrees with this particular translation, but ka is sky, right? Do bad. Do ka, bad sky, bad air. You surround yourself with negativity. Sukha is good. Surround yourself in good space. The idea is, how do you reduce the dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction? by reducing the influence that anatta has on you. So anatta. So reduce this influence the self has with feelings and perceptions and all these wants and desires. And this is what causes the dukkha, the dissatisfaction, because the outcome based on your ego or yourself will always be dissatisfying. And finally, the impermanence. Impermanence is to teach us two big things. The nature of self is impermanent, doesn't even exist. Right? But it goes back to emptiness. What is emptiness? Shunyata. It's actually just that what you think is you. How can you say, well, what makes my skin different than someone else's skin? Right? I have a skin disease, but so does 1 to 4% of the population have my particular skin disease. Same as when I sit now. I'm sitting, and arguably I may be using my own technique, but Anatta yoga or mudra yana. Mudra usually is the signs, the Dalai Lama's mudra, right? Dhyana mudra, right? Amitabha's mudra, right? Or something. I can't remember them all. There's 18 major, then Tantric has more. But the Mudrayana is not that type of Mudrayana. In fact, it's been kind of a mix. So there was Mudrayana, mudra, then there's the Tibetan idea of mudra just meaning any practice. So in this case, right, the Mudrayana, the Nada yoga, Tibetan yoga, is talking about the silent self and the sound of everything else. So it talks about hatha, ahata, and anhata. So ahata is this silent noise that we hear inside because we grasp to the self. Anhata is this external, right? External phenomena which we actually perceive secondhand, but neither here nor there. But the Anhata Nada Yoga speaks to exactly this. You're looking to find a balance between managing all of the aggregates of this universe, as Bhante G called reality, and managing the self that at once is our tool to navigate, but at also the number one hindrance to us perceiving the reality of what we need to perceive. Right? So when he says bhikkhus, when a noble follower who has heard the truth sees thus, he finds entanglement in form, he finds entanglement in feeling, he finds entanglement in perception, he finds entanglement in determinations, and he finds entanglement in consciousness. When he finds entanglement, passion fades out. So again, this is dependent origination. Right? I mentioned emptiness, shunyata, meaning you look at a picnic table, you don't just think, well, it used to be a tree and the tree grew because of sun and light and water. Sun and light is the same, I know. But you got to understand that the table, the picnic table sitting there, wood, is actually just, break it down to molecules, right? It's that idea. And the impermanence of such, right? Or I like to think of kasina, because I've been using kasina as well. What is kasina practice? It's actually visualization, but they use an external object. They use a candle or a campfire. I consider kasina to be one of our very first practices as a human being. I simply use it with closed-eyed visuals, as psychedelic travelers would call it. You use these closed-eyed visuals as your object of focus, of concentration or insight, but it allows you to stay focused so that you can tie up this self and see past it. Where are you trying to see past? You're trying to see that when entanglement ends, passion fades out. Fading of passion, one's liberated. When liberated, there is knowledge that he is liberated. He understands birth is exhausted. The holy life has been lived out. What can be done is done. Of this, there is no more beyond. So, what they're talking about here, birth is exhausted. So, what that means is when you find that in the cause of all of our suffering, in fact, even our existence on earth, is entangled with passion. What that means is this self that we believe exists. And we talk about feelings and perception and determination and about I and the self and ego. When you realize that entanglement, just like I explained, that the marks of existence, these are truths, absolutes, that nothing is permanent, impermanence, anatta, that life is dissatisfying because we lead an ego-based desire type, because the truth of it is, they say that suffering is guaranteed, dissatisfaction in this life is guaranteed, but it's not completely true, because if you realize that some people could live a life of their best life, a sattvic life, right? Try to be the best human being you can be. That's what sattvic means. Then maybe you won't experience near as much suffering as we might. But the same thing can be said is just like he talks. They're talking suffering and passion, right? These are these worldly winds, right? Love and hate, praise and blame. So again, they're using this to explain what they're getting at with this last sentence. So when entanglement ends, passion fades out, right? When the fading of passion, right? So cessation, nirodha, as we call it, like the opposite of, they call it outflows, the end of outflows. So this is this idea of no longer producing feelings or perceptions, right? No longer making determinations or volitions, choices that, based on this self. When there's knowledge, this is this wisdom, ultimate wisdom, sama sambodhi, right? Anattara samyak sambodhi. That's your goal. You want to get to the ultimate, not just knowledge, but the ultimate wisdom or the awareness that this entanglement of the self and the self not accepting the truth of impermanence, that it's not about the self. The self is not the center of the universe, if I can steal a turn of the phrase, and impermanence, right? Impermanence and dissatisfaction and the fact that self isn't what we think it is. So he says after that wisdom, that knowledge, that understanding, that awareness, moksha in the Gita, nirvana or samadhi, ultimate samadhi. He says birth is exhausted. The holy life has been lived out. Birth is exhausted is talking about stepping off the Dharma chakra, the wheel of becoming. Right? They say that this existence that we live is actually purely a manifestation of our choices in a between state. The Tibetans call the bardo. We choose to come and be born again because of ourself. Not that it exists, but because we cling to it, and therefore cling to the wheel of becoming, and therefore continue to be born and die, born again. So that's the nature of this suffering, whether it's metaphorical or not. Right? Because you can step off of this wheel of becoming, of suffering, of dissatisfaction, and still live a life. Because it has been discussed that the greatest challenge even, but one of the greatest examples would be to live amongst the unenlightened as an enlightened being. Because you're an example, obviously, which is the goal. I've always said that. I don't believe the true goal as a Sangha or as an Arhat is to achieve ultimate liberation, or at least not the entirety of the goal. Big part of that goal absolutely must be to live as an example within the unenlightened so that we can encourage others, if nothing else, but to achieve a small bit of respite from this samsaric existence. So that birth is exhausted. No longer are you trapped on this wheel of becoming. Next line is the holy life has been lived out. What does that mean? Well, we talk about being born as this great opportunity to achieve this liberation awareness and to step off this birth cycle, birth and death cycle. So the holy life is what we're talking. Again, this is a translation from the Pali. So again, this path of practice has been lived out. There's no need. Same as in the Heart Sutra, when Avalokitesvara encourages us, once we've reached the other shore, the Parasamgate, the destiny, the goal, right? We leave the Dharma behind, right? What can be done is done, right? So you've achieved your goal, right? And again, as I said, a lot of people get out of here as quick as possible because there is an entirely true risk both to the enlightened and to the stream enter that existence itself can actually knock us back a few pegs, right? And finally, it goes on and says, of this, there is no more beyond. Okay, so the Buddha, it depends on who you talk about. He either did or didn't talk about past lives, future lives, and all that idea. I personally don't believe that you need to have faith in reincarnation to be a believer in any of these paths. All you need to do is believe in karma, of cause and effect, of that dependent origination that I mentioned, right? That if I do this, this is the outcome, right? If I'm dealing with this, it's because of choices I've made. Accept, deal with, move on based on the right intention, morality, sila. And finally, he says, this is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were glad, and they approved his words. Now, during his utterance, the hearts of the bhikkhus of the group of five were liberated from taints through clinging no more. Right? So this is beautiful, because the second to last line talks about Blessed One, which is not a special one. He just happens to be the one that chose to stay and teach. The bhikkhus, these are all accomplished, yet again, seekers. They were glad, again, because it's a teaching. But finally, they approved his words. This is very important, because in very few other traditions are there both criticisms, but also the fact that every practitioner has the ability to use reason and logic to set aside anything that doesn't make sense. But a big part of that, remember, is a product of its time, but we are also guided by this one simple fact, that the Dharma entries, the entries to the Dharma doors of nirvana, depending on how you want to say it, right? This ultimate goal of moksha is achieved through an individual path. So sentient beings are numberless, as are the entryways to the Dharma of nirvana. Right? So they approved his words because, right, it's got to work for you. And finally it said, now, during this utterance, the hearts of the bhikkhu, the group of five, were liberated from taints through clinging no more. Right? So again, this is this, we're tainted or fetters. The idea is simply clinging. So this goes to the three poisons of ignorance, which, the opposite of which, is wisdom. So you remove ignorance with wisdom, understanding, or even striving, really. But it's attachment and aversion that are the other two in the three poisons. So here we're talking the taints. The taints, ignorance, hindrances, fetters of clinging. Clinging is both attachment and aversion, right? You cling to the good, and yet it ends, or you're averse, meaning you try to keep away the bad, but you can't, right? So again, this is the idea of anatta. So it's not no self, it's not even not self. It's about what is not the self, right? Feelings are not the self. Determinations are not the self. Perception is not the self. Form is not the self. None of it is the self. I don't know. So there you go. Any further questions? More than happy. Leave some comments. Playing around with some content here. We're probably going to move off to other channels because this particular account likely has some baggage attached to it because some subjects are not, popular, right? Natural healing, and honestly, even when you start talking about an alternate translation for some of these words, like I mentioned, the dukkha and the sukha, it makes perfect sense. Pali is a compound language. A lot of it meant multiple things, but when you break down sukha, right? S-U-K-H-A. Su means good. Ka means space or air, right? So our goal is not to surround ourselves with good air, not to surround ourselves with bad air, dukkha. Our goal is to find the middle, madhyamaka. Madhyamaka means the middle way. It's not insufficiency and it's not excessive. So with that, have a lovely day. Again, subscribe and leave a comment if you have any questions.